Thank you. Okay, so we're reaching the fourth and final week of this 4-week block on ecological stewardship, we've just to kind of give a sort of recap of what those lectures so far have been addressing in terms of the theme of how art engages with and might constitute forms of ecological stewardship, understood in a sort of expanded sense. We first heard from Felipa Ramos, who was talking about transhumancing the Alps, and she spoke about ideas of rights of nature and also of how through the curation of a biennale, a process of tracing sort of more than human migratory routes and forms of sort of cultural re-engagement with landscape. And then we heard from Shreya Chatterjee, who was talking about the politics of soil and air, with particular reference to examples in India and Australia, thinking particularly about how nationalist artistic idioms and indigenous artistic idioms might resist extractivism and might constitute a sort of, again, a sort of reconnection with land and with a kind of plural ecologies. And then finally last week we heard from Annalie Davis, who was talking about situating her practice within a sort of post-plantation context, thinking about regenerative and healing practices that are part of her artistic process. And then finally, this week we're hearing from, in person, from Lenka Vráblíkova, and she'll be speaking on the topic of othering Myco-Vision's Fungi in European colonial modernity. And I'm really grateful for Lenka to being here in person. It's really wonderful to have an in-person speaker finally. So the lecture will follow the usual format. Lenka will present for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions and responses after that. So I'm just going to introduce Lenka and then hand over to her. So Lenka Vráblíkova is a lecturer in the Department of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths, visiting research fellow at the University of Leeds, and member of LES, Wood's Community for Cultivation, Theory and Art. Her work lies at the intersection of visual culture studies with transnational feminisms, political ecology, feminist deconstruction, and critical university studies. Since 2017, and in collaboration with Dr. Elspeth Mitchell, the University of Leeds, Lenka has been developing research in feminist visual ethnomycology. So we're going to find out what ethnomycology is now, and so I'll hand over to Lenka now, and just really glad to have you with us.
Okay, hello everyone. And thank you, Ross, for such a lovely introduction, and thank you especially for this wonderful invitation as well, because it's really great to be part of this lecture series and being together here thinking with you about the questions related to ecology, political ecology, decolonization, feminism, and queer studies, and art, obviously. So, can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Okay. I also want to say that the topic I will be talking about today, othering Myco-Visions, represent only a segment of the work I have been doing on fungi, and that I have not been doing this work alone, as Ross already mentioned, but with my friend and collaborator, Elspeth Mitchell. Here you can see Elspeth posing with myself and a mushroom called chicken of the woods. In Czech we call her Sirovec žluto-oranžový on this picture. Since 2017, Elspeth and I have been working on what we call feminist visual ethnomycology. This research has been interested in various questions that have been appearing to us thanks to our love for feminism and fungi, and that I have not been doing this work. Sorry, I already said that. Our love for fungi, questions particularly around embodiment and belonging, critical and feminist decolonizing pedagogy, and also questions that came up thanks to the unprecedented attention fungi have been recently gaining, particularly in the English-speaking world, especially the mycelium, which is the root-like structure that forms the main body part of a fungus and that can be found underground, growing in the soil, has nowadays been growing also through other, so to speak, substrates. The world of technoscience, entrepreneurship, environmental activism, green capitalism, theory, art, and popular culture. Within academia, people now speak about mushroom fever. And it led some scholars announce yet another major and newest turn within feminist thought, which is called mycological turn. It seems to us that within the last 10 to 15 years, we have been witnessing a situation in which fungi have become instrumental to how various humans active in the above-mentioned segments of society make sense of their relationship to themselves, to other humans, to non-humans and the world, and the way in which they imagine the future. So I'm sure you maybe, or maybe not, heard about all these ideas around how mushrooms can save the world, how they can be used in microremediation to clean the polluted soil and water, how psychoactive mushrooms have been used in research of treatment of depression and anxiety and addictions. Now you can have a bacon which is made out of mushrooms, right? You can have shoes, you can have buildings built out of mushrooms. So there is a lot of kind of like ideas around future and the possibility of future where mushrooms became instrumental for that possibility. But obviously the questions we will be asking is whose future that is, right? And who is articulating these ideas about the future, which narratives we can hear and which are not heard, right? So, on the one hand, our work is undoubtedly resourced by this mushroom fever. I mean, look at the expression of overexcitement on both our faces. There's no doubt that we are both hooked on these captivating and fascinating organisms we call fungi. On the other hand, however, our aim is to intervene in this mushroom fever we and others have been experiencing, and to examine the traces fungi and their metaphors leave in the political and aesthetic articulations of nationhood, race, gender, sexuality, and the human and non-human relations. One of the ways in which this intervention can be analytically grasped is through the term mentioned in the title of my talk, the term Myco-Visions. Myco-Visions aims not only to indicate that in my feminist explorations with fungi, I'm primarily interested in visual culture, but also the specific methodological approach I'm taking. This approach is akin to what Anna Tsing, you can see her on the picture, Anna Tsing describes as the art of noticing, Robin Wall-Kimmerer as a process of learning to see, and Amy Bang as wondering with, rather than marveling at. Myco-Visions are also related to Donna Haraway's conceptualization of vision that appears in her early work, especially in the chapter Situated Knowledges or in this book called Primate Visions. Today, I will focus on a particular kind of Myco-Visions that create an effect of othering. I conceptualize othering as a complex set of differentiating temporal and spatial bodily encounters along the established binary trope native and alien, and its correlates, human and non-human, citizen and foreigner, male and female, civilized and primitive, global north and global south, and European west and European east. This mode of encountering has dominated the world since the beginning of European colonial modernity and has benefited those who have been associated with white, European, masculine, cis heterosexual, and non-disabled bodies inhabiting the global north at the expense of those who have not. My conceptualization of othering draws from the work of feminist and postcolonial scholars who have theorized it as a contextual, contradictory, and fluid process, and particularly the work of Sara Ahmed and this book called Strange Encounters, and the work of scholars who have been thinking about othering, especially in relation to the currently re-emerging fascist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, and sexist far-right in Europe. And since I'm going to be speaking about fascism and racist far-right, I want to give a trigger warning that the talk includes illustrations and few direct quotations from a Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda. But before I get to the particular examples of how fungi have figured in the political imagination of European colonial modernity, I want to mention another conceptualization I use in my work, the distinction between mycophilia and mycophobia. This distinction meant to capture the polarity of attitudes towards fungi. It was proposed by two people who in the English-speaking world are now considered to be founders of ethnomycology, which is the science of how humans relate to fungi, right, in history, but also in the contemporary world. So the two people are the Russian-born doctor and US emigree Valentina Pavlovna Wasson, her surname when she was born was Gerken before marriage, and her husband Gordon Wasson, who was an American banker. With these terms, Wassons sought to conceptualize a difference they observed between societies that embraced and esteemed fungi, such as the Slavic culture, from which both Valentina and I come from, and cultures that disdain fungi, such as the English-speaking cultures, for instance, the culture of Valentina's husband, Gordon Wasson, the white settler colonial culture of the United States of America. As you will see from the analysis I will present today, I work with mycophobia and mycophilia not so much as exclusive binaries that would define sentiments shared by whole societies, but rather as critically entangled and mutually constitutive cultural positions. But before we move to the analysis, I want to say one more thing about Valentina and Gordon Wasson's fungal explorations. Particularly, Gordon Wasson is famous for his expeditions to research use of psychoactive fungi in religious and healing rituals of indigenous populations in Mexico, taking part in a sacred mushroom ceremony led by Mazatec healer and shaman Maria Sabina. This is Maria Sabina. I believe that these expeditions and the issues that surrounded them, for instance, the fact that the 1956 expedition was funded by the CIA, of which Gordon Wasson was unaware of, according to the archives, or the events that followed the publication of an article that features this experience in a popular US magazine Life, which wasn't published despite Sabina's request to keep the experience private, would make a very important case study of othering Myco-Vision's analysis. But today, we will stay in Europe, where the distinction between mycophobic and mycophilic cultures is also exemplified by the UK on the one hand, and the Czech Republic, where I am from originally, on the other hand. The two countries also epitomize the European geopolitical west and east axis, which together with the global north and global south axis defines the unjust global distribution of power and resources. So let us begin in the so-called West, here in the United Kingdom. I will begin with an instance of othering Myco-Visions that started this whole inquiry. In 2017, Elspeth and I facilitated our first mushroom hunting and feminist reading walk. During the walk, one of the participants recalled reading stories about fungus foraging gangs of Eastern Europeans raiding British forests that were appearing in the media in 2015. As those who were in the UK during that time would recall, 2015 was a year when the public debate began to focus on a topic which was to define the overall political, economic, and cultural course of the country. The Brexit campaign, that is, the campaign for the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union. One of the key points of the campaign was stark opposition against the immigration, presented as a means of restating the sovereignty of the British people, depicted as being under siege. British media, and especially the tabloid press, were instrumental in the fabrication and dissemination of this message. An article with the headline, which you can see on the slide, Eastern European mushroom mobs, new forest is stripped bare by fungi restless, published in the tabloid The Daily Express, shows how forests and their inhabitants, particularly fungi and their foragers, provided yet another opportunity to convey this message. In the article, the reporter informed the British public that, and I will quote from the article, rangers patrolling the New Forest are on high alert amidst fierce black market gangs, many thought to be Eastern Europeans, who are stripping the beauty spots of its edible mushrooms. Experts, the reporter continued, have warned the gangs could even kill, because pickers, who don't know the different species, are likely to take deadly toadstools and other poisonous fungi in mistake for edible and safe mushrooms. The spokesman of New Forest Association blasted it as an unacceptable theft that was spoiling the forest's autumn beauty and harming the wildlife. They added that every year, bands full of unskilled laborers descend upon the forest and indiscriminately strip our woodlands of every bit of fungi they encounter, leaving nothing for the families on a day's outing in the forest who want a few mushrooms as a mealtime treat. The reporter further speculated that these gangs are thought to include cheap labor in the form of EU immigrants. Finally, the readers were informed that New Forest was not the only site where the gangs operated, but that other forests were also endangered, concluding with a demand for clear policy and strict regulation that would put total ban on mushroom removal. And today we know the outcome of the Brexit campaign, and we know that Brexit, in a way, provided the solution to the problem raised by the article, although it was not the solution the article called for. Instead of mushroom picking, what Brexit promises to ban are the EU immigrants. So, as the quotation testifies, the newspaper article employs language of othering that is reminiscent of racist and classist condemnations of travelers, Jews, as well as Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, that has long tradition in the UK media, and which, in the aftermath of the so-called war on terror and migration crisis, has been used particularly in relation to Muslim communities. The article mobilizes various tropes of othering. The intruders are already known and recognized as the origin of the danger. That the mushroom mobs are Eastern Europeans, which is a vague and homogenizing term used in the UK in disparaging manner to name people from Central and Eastern Europe, as well as a synonym specifically for Polish people, is presented as a given, and a common knowledge which the reporter shares with those she has interviewed as well as her readers. Additionally, their activities are depicted as sinister and violent attack, whilst expressions such as full vans descend every year, or plural form of words that already invoke great numbers, such as gangs or mobs, portray the mushroom pickers as being too many, as being overabundant. Finally, the othering proceeds not only through verbal, but also through visual means. The two accompanying photographs that you see here are generic stock images that depict mushrooms growing in their habitat or recently picked and placed in the basket. The images are framed so the face of the person who picked them is not visible. Missing a head, the mushroom forager is depersonalized, which erases the singularity of an individual and blends it with the figuration of a monolithic group of strangers, thus enabling not only stereotyping, but also the feeling of hate, as it helps defer empathy, compassion, as well as guilt. Another trope of othering that is employed in the photographs and is central to both of their compositions is a knife, which the faceless, light-skinned person, coded as masculine, holds in their hand. To be sure, a knife along walking shoes, raincoat, basket, or cloth bag is among the equipment that is commonly used for mushroom picking. The knife is used for cleaning of the mushrooms, for the removal of debris such as soil and needles, and for carving away the soiled stalk and inedible parts. Another reason that mushroom pickers use knives for foraging is because it helps separate the fruiting body, what we usually call mushroom, right? What you see above the ground, from the hyphae, the long individual threads that comprise a mycelium without disturbing or damaging the hyphae, and thus supporting its further growth. In these images, however, a knife does not invoke techniques of careful harvesting, but a harmful attack. In one of the photographs, the knife is positioned in the direction of a mushroom that has just been cut. In the other photograph, while one hand protectively grabs on the basket full with mushrooms, the other holds a knife with its blade directed towards the viewer, suggesting that the potential victim of the stabbing is also the reader of the Daily Express. The two images thus effectively convey the newspaper article's key message. It is not only British forests and edible mushrooms that are threatened by the invasion of gangs from Eastern Europe, but also the nation and its people. The United Kingdom, this advanced material and fantasized entity, is taken hostage by the immigrants. Just have a bit of water. So, drawing from Sarah Ahmed's work, we can argue that this xenophobic and anti-immigration sentiment relies on the idea of an idealized we, a community of normal citizens depicted as presently being in crisis, and that is complemented with a fantasy of the time of unspoiled unity and prosperity, that is, the time before the so-called attack of the intruders. Ahmed develops this analysis in relation to urban spaces, for instance, to criminal prevention discourses or neighborhood watch programs. What my analysis adds to this is that situating this strategy of othering within a forest amplifies its effects. Firstly, the proximity of nature that has traditionally been presented as being outside of culture and history makes othering look natural. It helps to represent otherness as inherent quality, to normalize othering and justify it as morally right. Secondly, it gets even more intensified when the given natural location is a forest. This is due to the position forests have occupied in the European imagination of the never fully secure and in fact always collapsing distinction between the inside and the outside of sociality. So the Latin root of the word forest is foris, and that translates as outside. And most importantly, the role forests have played particularly in the constitution of the idea of the modern nationhood and national belonging. And the most famous is maybe thinking about being German and forest, but there are also studies, a lot of studies have been done also on the case of Poland, for instance, and what does it mean to be Polish, but also British? Because if you think about New Forest, that is the oldest forest, which was started by William the Conqueror, which is the Normans, the intruders, right? So there is a very interesting kind of like a relationship to forests in the British culture as well. So clearly, by the yearning for an idealized homogeneous nation does not define only the current political climate in the UK. Here, it might, among many, be Eastern Europeans who are at the receiving end of the anti-immigration outcry. At home, however, these who are figured as strangers and feared as dangerous in the UK become the normal citizens in need of protection from others figured as dangerous strangers. I'm saying this because I want to make clear that my intention is not to reiterate the claim to victimhood and innocence of white Central East and Eastern Europeans, as has often been done, in an attempt to negotiate the complex and complicit relationship with European colonialism, also revealed within the context of Brexit. Especially after the end of socialism, in Central and Eastern European countries, where the majority of the population has not been coded as racially, religiously, or civilizationally absolutely different from the so-called core Europeans, nationalism and the unspoken insistence on whiteness have become the most effective means of asserting Europeanness. Furthermore, as political sociologist Akbujo Emejulu rightly points out, the hostility, exploitation and violence which white immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe have experienced in the UK before and after Brexit, unfortunately, do not guarantee any imperative to dismantle racial hierarchy and racism. Within the analysis of the Brexit campaign, the necessity to distinguish... No, sorry, I skipped the paragraph. Okay. I thus not only agree with scholars who insist that race or racialization is still a useful and necessary category of critical analysis, I also find important to make the distinction proposed by scholar of trans and queer feminisms, Alyosha Tudor, between racism and what they call migratism. And I quote, "Migratism is the discrimination based on the ascription of migration, which is intimately linked with racism, but is still different from it." End of quote. Within the analysis of the Brexit campaign, the necessity to distinguish between racism and migratism is perhaps most explicitly visible in the infamous poster Breaking Point of the Eurosceptic right-wing populist party, the UKIP. The poster depicted Syrian refugees at the borders of another EU member state, Slovenia, with a subheading, "We must break free of the EU and take back control." Although the Brexit campaigners claim that their anti-immigration stance had nothing to do with race, this poster and analysis conducted by scholars such as already mentioned Akbuja Majulu or another sociologist Gurminder K. Bambra showed the centrality of race and racism to the Brexit campaign. So the ultimate target of the campaign were not the white inhabitants of Central and Eastern Europe, but people of global majority, that is, non-white people, presented as not belonging to Europe. And I want to make one more comment about the Breaking Point poster, because that will be useful later with the other examples. As it was noted by several commentators, the poster was also a reference to a Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda film that demonized Jews and other minorities in the aftermath of the First World War. And obviously, UKIP denied that connection, but I'm showing you two shots from the film here for your comparison. And I'll just also read what it says in the captions there, because that will, you will recognize that language later. Who flooded Europe's cities after the last war? Parasites, undermining their host countries. Okay, but let us move away from the UK for a bit and relocate to Central and Eastern Europe, and particularly to the Czech Republic. In this region, mushroom hunting is a common practice, and Valentina and Gordon Wasson would undoubtedly describe Czech society as a perfect example of myco-philic, that is, mushroom-loving society. Here, Fungi have also been deployed as a figure through which to negotiate Czech national identity within the framework of the hegemonic geopolitical status quo rooted in European colonialism. One of my examples is a Facebook post by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from September 2020, which says, and that's the, you can read it, that's in English, Czechs are among the most passionate mushroom hunters in the world, with over 70% of the population heading out at least once a year. It is true. An unparalleled number globally. Czechia may therefore be regarded as mushroom-picking superpower. To be clear, Czech Republic has never been a superpower, in the sense in which this word has been used in the post-colonial era, that is, as a term that describes a state with a dominant position and extensive ability to exert influence and project power through economic, military, political, and cultural means on the global scale. Nor did Czech Republic's predecessor, Czechoslovakia, a state that was created in 1918 after the declaration of independence from Austria-Hungary, was an official colonial power. And although Czechs have also understood themselves as being outside of the realm of colonialism, this does not mean that the country and its inhabitants have not engaged in the colonial project and have not benefited from it. And scholarship calls this colonialism without colonies or colonial complicity, and I think it's very useful for us to do research on Central and Eastern Europe, these terms. In this example that involves mushroom foraging, we can see how the replication of the hegemonic colonial worldview, the idea that there are superpowers, right, which rests on the idea, and the normalization of an idea that there are states with power and states without the power, that there are winners and losers, is mobilized for the construction of the Czech national identity. And even though it is something that might seem banal or anecdotal, as mushroom picking, Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs nonetheless does identify Czech Republic as being on the side of the winners, of the superpowers. And next to that Facebook post, you can see that's a tweet from a candidate to a Senate. He was, I hope he was not anymore, MP Karel Reis. And in this post, you can read it down there. It's an English translation. He expresses his love for mushroom hunting as well as his family. He vows to fight against the measures that seek to limit and tax mushroom foraging that is apparently being forced on Czechs, presumably by the EU. So it is a very good program if you think that 70% of population collects mushrooms, right? So yeah, a properly populist kind of move, right? And also an example of this representation of the community as being in the crisis, being under siege, right? And we are, endangered by the EU bringing all these regulations, and my family is in danger, and all these kind of various tricks or rhetorical populist means using that. However, using fungi and mushroom foraging in the definitions of belonging and non-belonging in cis heteronormative white Christian European nation state is not a recent phenomenon. This association was infamously immobilized in an anti-Semitic propaganda children's picture book called Der Gipfels, which to English can be translated as poisonous mushroom. In Czech, the book is called Jedovatá houba. The picture book was first published by a publisher Der Stürmer in Nazi Germany in 1938, and it featured as evidence in a trial with the owner of the publishing house, Julius Streicher, who was convicted of being an accessory for crimes against humanity in the Nuremberg trials and was executed in 1946. Another important thing to mention about this picture book is that it was recently republished by publishers connected to the alt-right and neo-Nazi groups, for instance in the United States in 2008, and it was republished in Czech Republic in 2020, and you can still buy it online. So the purpose of the book was not only to indicate fear and hate, but also activate engagement in the persecution of Jews, paving the way and explicitly calling for the extermination of Jewish population. As you can see on the cover of the book, the publication relied on the dehumanization of Jews through a comparison with poisonous fungi. A caricature of a Jewish man as toadstool includes the Star of David at the bottom of the mushroom stem and exaggerates features that are crude stereotypes of Jewish appearance, such as crooked face, thick lips, a large bent nose, and a beard. The red of the beard could also be read as pointing to the alleged connection between Jews and other demonized group in Nazi Germany, the communists, as well as an indication of the mushroom's toxicity. The beard forms a ring on the mushroom stem, which is characteristic of Amanitas. You have two examples here. Amanitas is a genus that includes some of the most toxic known mushrooms. The caricature invokes two Amanitas in particular, according to my interpretation. Amanita phalloides, which in English is called the death cap. In Czech, we call her Mochomurka zelená. And Amanita muscaria, in English known as the fly agaric, and in Czech is called Muchomurka červená. Finally, that the mushroom is poisonous is also suggested by the expression in man's face that demonstrates the effects of the malignant poisoning he is supposed to cause to the bodies of others. The book thematizes a key and distinct feature of modern anti-Semitism, the obsession with the ability to identify a Jewish person. As scholar of race and anti-racism Alana Lentin argues, and I quote from her, modern anti-Semitism was born not from the great difference between groups, but rather from the threat of absence of difference, which was a result of Jews' relative integration into bourgeois society and the imposition of increasingly narrow definitions of belonging in European nation states. The theme of correct identification is developed throughout the whole book. It opens with a story set up during mushroom picking in the forest, where a mother teaches her son, through a comparison between edible and poisonous mushrooms, the difference between good and bad people, the bad people being Jews. The publication also lists the allegedly Jewish features, most of which define the stereotypes of Jews that endure to this day. For instance, in addition to the distinct shape of a nose, the list also includes filthy, protruding, large ears. Finally, the publication also invokes overabundance of those identified as intruders. Here, the sense of overabundance is constructed through an analogy with poisonous mushrooms. It is stated in the book that, and I quote, "Just as poisonous mushrooms spring up everywhere, so the Jew is found in every country in the world." End of quote. Historian of colonialism Neil McMaster argues that the association between Jews and fungi that connects both to the danger of decadence, degeneration, and disease became common in the 19th century through images or metaphors of Jews as a monstrous fungus, a parasitic growth that fed upon the healthy body of the host society. This fear of Jews being everywhere is linked to a key feature of modern anti-Semitism mentioned above, the obsession with the inability to identify a Jewish person. The invocation of overabundance is thus twofold, in the sense of quantity, as being too many, as well as boundlessness, being all over the world, and implies a threat of intruders attacking and overwhelming the nation in large numbers from the outside, as well as the danger of the nation's destruction from the inside through anti-national sentiments such as cosmopolitanism. That the medium which conveys such extreme anti-Semitism is a children's picture book should not come as a surprise. As the colonial philosopher Rosina Mart argues, the global white hegemonic culture relies on the reproduction of racism in fairy tales told to children about the native and the indigenous as a villain hiding in the depths of woods, ready to kill and destroy their families. In relation to fairy tales specific to Europe, Mart's analysis shows how othering operates in relation to the figure of a witch. Can't pronounce W. The content that the representation of witches is not only a result of heteropatriarchal gendering that demonizes and brutalizes proletariat and peasant adult and elder women, but is also racialized. The witch is a representation of a Jewish woman, characterized as dark and physically deformed with crooked features. Racism, as well as particular form as anti-Semitism, are thus global phenomena that predicate the rise of Nazism in Central Europe in the 1930s. Furthermore, it is written not only into state structures and practices, but also into common sense, folk knowledge, and modern science. My last example of othering Myco-Visions that involves the history and taxonomy of a species of mushroom of a Latin name Auricularia auricula, a joint creation of European folk knowledge and scientific nomenclature, illustrates this point. This fungus, in English known under various names as jelly ear or wood ear, does anyone know this mushroom?
Yes.
Yes. Have you eaten it?
Yes.
Yes. Did you like it? Yes.
It's healthy.
Yeah.
Healthy and healthy. What is clean?
Yeah. How do you call it?
In China, we call it black ear.
Is it Hei Mu Er?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
After raining.
Yeah.
I picked it when I was young.
Yeah. And what is the name in the language you would use to call the mushroom? Mandarin, or which language do you speak? Mu'ar. Okay.
Yes, mu'ar. It's Mandarin.
Okay. Because a colleague told me that it's Hei Mu Er. Yeah? But that's maybe not good pronunciation. I can see you smiling. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry for the pronunciation. Yeah, so this fungus, in English known under various names such as jelly ear or wood ear, is widely distributed pinkish brown to dark brown mushroom, distinctive for its ear-like shape. Auricularia auricula grows in stemless clusters on dead and living wood, especially elder. It can be found throughout all seasons in temperate and subtropical regions worldwide, especially in damp and shaded areas. The reason why jelly ears are so prolific is also because of their host, the elder tree, that can be found almost everywhere, and that is sometimes considered as an invasive species. Auricularia auricula is edible and has long been used has also been used in medicine. It is popular in China, in Asia, especially in China, where it is called what I thought is pronounced heimu-e, which translates as blackwood ears. In Europe, however, this fungus is neither sought after by mushroom foragers, nor is it widely consumed, even though it has been recognized as a distinctive species, at least since the 16th century. Jelly ear has appeared under its Latin medieval name Auricula Judae, which in translation means ear of Judas, a name which the scientific nomenclature also adopted in the 19th century. This name still features as Auricularia auricula Judae in some of the current mycology books, including the famous and otherwise amazing Mushroom Comprehensive Guide by Roger Phillips, from which I took this photograph. The Latin name Auricularia auricula Judae matches the vernacular name in most European languages, including English, where the mushroom is not called Judas ear, but by an even more disturbing rendering, Jew's ear. Most commonly, mycology literature maintains that the name Judas ear is derived from the belief that Judas Iscariot, after betraying Jesus Christ, hanged himself from an elder tree, and treats the shift from Judas ear to Jew's ear as a mere mistranslation. However, the names Judas ear and Jew's ear have both been in circulation already in the 16th century, so instead of being a mere, let alone innocent mistranslation, it seems that the name of this fungus is rather a result of widespread anti-Semitism, characteristic of European medieval folk knowledge, as well as of another system of knowledge which appeared with modernity. Scientific taxonomy and systemics predicated upon the lineal binomial system of classification and hierarchization of life forms. And you can see these names in various languages. So in Czech it is called Jirášovo ucho. Yeah, I will not dare to pronounce the other one. I want to add a further point to the anti-Semitic naming of Auricularia auricula. After a brief encounter with their Gipfels, with this one, which includes among the alleged characteristic features of Jewish people, filthy, protruding, large ears, and complaints about the overabundance of Jews through the analogy with poisonous mushrooms, as well as Rosina Mart's analysis of witches as a representation of Jewish women characterized as dark and with physically deformed crooked features who hide in the depths of the woods, it is evident that the anti-Semitism of the history and taxonomy of Auricularia auricula does not involve only language or discourse, but also bodies. This is, however, not to argue that the otherness is found on or in Jewish bodies or the bodies of certain fungi, as if these bodies and the way they inhabit spaces were the origin of their otherness, or of this otherness, not theirs. That's the point, that it is not theirs, right? For instance, consider the anti-Semitic association between fungi, overabundance, and Jewish people, which is central to their Gipfels, and the naming of Auricularia auricula as Judas ear and Jew's ear. And going back to the first example of othering Myco-Visions, how it is echoed in the Brexit campaign. Here, overabundance, as a sign of the danger and potential harm, is distributed differently across the various bodies of humans and non-humans. The way in which a knife figures in the photographs that accompany the Daily Express newspaper article can serve as another example. Here, a knife does not invoke techniques of careful harvesting, which foragers use to pick mushrooms without disturbing or damaging the fungus hyphae, but as a harmful attack. So to conclude, I hope that my analysis of various examples of fungi in the political imagination of European colonial modernity showed that although othering proceeds along the established binaries such as native and alien, and its various correlates, the way it proceeds is neither uniform nor clear-cut. The way othering operates is contextual, complex, and fluid. Sometimes it is even contradictory. Another point I hope came across is that research into social and environmental histories of places such as forests, and organisms such as fungi is vital for the critical interrogation of the recent re-emergence of the right-wing populism and racist, homophobic, and sexist nationalisms that in the UK is exemplified by events such as the Brexit campaign. Lastly, I hope that I showed that in order to contest the material, discursive, and fantasized structures that produce and naturalize othering, we need to understand that racialization has been a central principle of European colonial modernity, as well as of its current afterlife. My work tries to contribute to this project of contesting the structures that produce and naturalize othering by following fungi. Thank you for listening.
But Lenka, thanks so much. That was an extraordinary lecture and gives so much food for thought in terms of, I think one of the kind of really important things for me is the way in which you're throwing a sort of spotlight on how ideas of nature and ecological stewardship gets harnessed to xenophobic far-right agendas, both through from a position of sort of anxiety about certain life forms such as mushrooms, as you get in this country often, and conversely through a sort of professed love for particular landscapes and life forms, as in mycophilia. And I think it's particularly timely to hear about this research at this time, as you say, that there's been this sort of extraordinary mycological turn, which has been such a sort of feature of the environmental humanities, of contemporary art making, but also green capitalism and a phenomenon that sometimes gets characterized sort of a kind of a turn towards medicinal alternatives and so on. So it seems particularly important to pay attention to the ways in which ideas about how mushrooms, as you say, serve as this metaphor for all sorts of relationships. And this seems to be one of their kind of key powers. But as you say, they're also seen as this sort of world-saving force, right? They're going to cure us of all sorts of diseases. They're going to house us. They're going to clothe us, and so on.
They're going to make art for us.
They make art for us, right? Yeah. All the time, yeah. So I thought that this description of sort of, you call it mushroom fever, and the way in which, as you say, it opens up these whole questions of like, whose future are mushrooms building? Who gets access to these forms of knowledge and so on? And then you set out very carefully these sort of processes of othering that have been such a sort of feature of European coloniality, and there was such a sort of incredibly useful set of ideas and terms that you introduced us to, and particularly the way in which there's a sort of celebration of mycology. We're all delighted by it. It's really charming. If you watch nature documentaries about mushrooms, they're with sort of cute voices, and we all love forests. It's sort of like this Disneyfied world, but the sort of dark, sort of disturbing history of how research has been funded, defunded, associated with narrative sort of policy around criminalisation and so on. I mean, there's a whole vast history there which wasn't the subject of this this lecture. And then you spoke very interestingly about how discourses around mushrooms have sort of fed into the mainstreaming of far-right views, particularly around the time of Brexit. And it does seem like whenever there's a kind of moment where the right is trying to sort of push through a set of, or kind of mainstream, a set of really extremist views, nature comes into a particular kind of focus, right? And we get it through the discourses around gardening in the Daily Mail, but also, as you demonstrated, through the way in which mushroom foraging is represented. So I thought there were some really interesting distinctions you made between migratism and racism, how they are both interlinked but distinct. That seems a really helpful clarification. And then the sort of painful but important work of understanding the genealogies of anti-Semitic and racist propaganda so as to recognise them for what they are, really, and how they have a very long history in Europe. You spoke about colonial complicity and how this is a feature of white cultures within Europe that did not necessarily themselves have empires, and the way in which anti-European, anti-EU populist rhetoric kind of builds on that. And then there's the extremely disturbing use of mushroom metaphors in anti-Semitic propaganda, and the various tropes of that you sketched out for us, the importance of children's literature in the reproduction of racial categories, and so on. And this kind of meeting point that you described in colonial modernity of where scientific taxonomy meets folk knowledge. And I found that a very interesting conjunction that you set out for us. And so a couple of kind of questions immediately come to mind. You spoke at the end about the importance of doing environmental history and the sort of the kind of the careful study of life forms and species to counter far-right metaphors that get harnessed to these agendas. And I wondered if you wanted to sort of elaborate a little bit more on that, because also these kind of metaphors and like ecology is full of kind of quite disturbing uses of language as well, lichens colonize, so on and so forth. So I wondered if we might start with perhaps you could set out a little bit more about how you see that operating, then we could open it out to the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. That was an amazing summary. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think this is very important, the use of that language. But what I was trying to say at the end, it can just switch immediately, right? So, for instance, what I think with what I call this mushroom fever, firstly, I think what is very interesting that it just happens in English-speaking countries. English-speaking countries are real latecomers to the mushroom fever. There have been societies and sciences looking at that in Central Eastern Europe, in Japan, in China for hundreds of years. But suddenly this thing becomes big when it happens in English, right? And that's why I was also saying at the beginning that Valentina and Gordon Wasson are considered in the UK to be founders of ethnomycology, and how that history of what the science of mushrooms and ethnomycology and mycology, how is now with that interest in mushrooms being written as an English science, right? Which I think is really, really interesting. And it just happens like that in a year or two. And and when you start speaking about different cultures, like the Central and Eastern European, the mycophilic ones, or about Japan or China, immediately there's this turn where those producers of that knowledge are now suddenly being seen as being possible object of ethnomycological study, or some kind of ethnography, like how me and my granny would go picking mushrooms in Czech Republic, right? Rather than acknowledging that there has been a science, right? Very long kind of what we would call modern scientific discourse on mycology, right? So I think that is very interesting. And and with that, connected to that question you actually asked about the language and how that language is used. So with the mushroom fever, I think, because I'm part of that, definitely, I think it's important to realize what's going on, that there are various agents in the world using this metaphor, and that maybe things like rhizomatic network, which is non-hierarchical, can be instrumental for very different agents in the society. So it's not just people who want feminist socialist revolution like me, right, speaking about mycelium, but it's also people from Bitcoins, right? They speak about Bitcoin as being a mycelium, right? Or people who are thinking about migration and who try to predict migration from places like Mexico to the USA they're using mushrooms to predict those traces or to predict those routes. So there is a lot of different people who are projecting their fantasies and their expectations on this organism. And I think that our role as people thinking with culture critically is to see what's going on and intervene in it somehow. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, questions, responses? I mean, just while the thoughts are sort of filtering through, I was also thinking about the way in which the sort of suppression of mycological knowledge in the US particularly is also part of a kind of longer history of the war on drugs and a sort of deliberate suppression of who gets to access that kind of knowledge and what it might be used for and so on. And I've been reading about how at the moment the psychotropic capacities of mushrooms, which are credited with making people more open-minded to new ideas, for example, there's a lot of focus from the far right in actually harnessing those capacities for the purposes of recruitment as well. So we're in this strange moment, and sometimes that kind of meeting point of far right politics with sort of hippie alternative approaches is called cosmic right, and mushrooms seem to be right at the heart of that as well.
Yeah, definitely. And also actually, that's so interesting that mycological situation in the US really comes to that point of, or the interest in psychoactive mushrooms, because in Eastern and Central Europe, this is not the case. We just collect edibles. Well, of course, some people collect different ones as well, but my granny just collects the edible mushrooms, and it's all about edible mushrooms. It's not about psychoactive mushrooms, and it's not even about medicinal mushrooms. That knowledge somehow got lost in that region or in that society. It's all about the edibles. So that kind of focus and what you want from them also is related to that, which I think is also very interesting. And there is various speculations why that would be. People say that the reason why the focus is on food in relation to mushrooms in Central and Eastern Europe might be because of the experience of hunger, of war. So you had to learn to go and fetch yourself food in the forest. Yeah.
Okay, there's several questions. So, Matty, do you want to start, and then we'll go to Michael?
Hello. So, thank you, that was really interesting. My own research is looking at invasive species at the minute, and I'm kind of interested in the way that if a plant or a person or an invasive species in general is labelled as useful, then maybe it has the potential to stay, and that xenophobic language can change. It's not so much a question, just if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think totally right. And also when you would say that, who counts as being who counts as being ours, right? And who is the foreigner, and how it changes with time. That that the time of when the species were introduced, I think, is also interesting. But I don't have anything to say about that. That kind of analogy between invasive species and how there is this obviously xenophobic and anti-immigrant kind of language. That's definitely there. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks. That was a really fascinating talk. Speaking myself as somebody from Czech Jewish migrant heritage, I was very interested in the anti-Semitic connotation of the mushroom. I really had no idea about that. So I'm wondering a little bit more, why mushrooms specifically? I mean, I can see you say, it's fairly obvious with something like vermin, for example, that is a way of othering. But things seem perhaps, more complex and contradictory with mushrooms, as you were showing, because of that mixture of, a beneficial and poisonous aspect. So there's the mushroom is like a pharmacon. It's both cure and poison. But that also means that the poison can be disguised as a cure. So, maybe the racist dimension has something to do with that. And particularly with anti-Semitism as opposed to racism against people with black and brown bodies. The Jew can hide. The Jew might easily pass as a non-Jew or be assimilated or something like that, and you wouldn't even realize that it was a Jew, and then by accident you would be poisoned somehow. So, does that play into it?
Yeah, thank you for that question and that comment. And this is actually how I think about mushrooms, as being this super pharmacon, right? Like this remedy and poison, and having these two sides. But I think what these people I was mentioning, who did the research on the 19th century, I think it's important that it happens in the 19th century, where that connotation between this anti-Semitic idea of fungus comes around, because firstly, the science is developing, right? So you can actually, there is this research that there is something like a fungus, there is something like a mold, right? It causes, illness. There is this connection with decay, right? So I think that is an important point. And the second one, which you mentioned about the identification, right? And passing, right? So there's this fear of not being able to identify a Jewish person in Europe, right? But at the same time, the whole nationalisms are rising, right? So the definition of who belongs and who doesn't, and if there is someone we cannot tell, right, is causing enormous amount of anxiety. And I think that in that moment of history, with these two, or three things coming together, there's this phobia which comes out so extremely in that Gipfel's book, right? And that whole thing around, you're in the forest, right? There's again the family and the mother and the son, and they're learning the identification, right? So, and the features to recognize someone who doesn't belong. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure also a lot of people here will be going on to the opening of Ghost Show Haunted House, which is a show put on by Goldsmiths students, MFA students tonight. And there is this kind of association with horror as well, through the forest and through the potential of being poisonous and so on, isn't there?
Yeah, and also they're really, what do you think about mushrooms? They're super weird, right? They're actually closer to animals than to plants. They don't look like plants, right? People thought that they came from the cosmos, they're like little UFOs, right? Who just landed on the Earth. Linnaeus didn't know what to do with them, so he said, the father of the nomenclature of scientific names, he said, well, I'm going to name it Chaos, the group where they belong, because he really couldn't tell what it was, right? So there was this kind of confusion also around how they grow, right? They grow pretty unexpectedly, especially the one which are mycorrhizal, which are connected with different species. You cannot grow them, right? But at the same time, you would find these lines or these fairy rings, right? So these things are just like, asking for people to project this extremely, various and pharmacon-like projections into mushrooms, I think. And that's why they're so potent for people to put and invest their sentiments in them.
So we've got another question here.
Hello.
I'm really curious to ask why the super anti-Semitic book has been republished, especially in modern times, especially with the rise in fungus mania, fungus fever. And what do you think the political meanings are, therefore, of the people participating in fungus fever? And if that book is geared towards them, or as a sort of just overall political tool, is not really meant for real reading and publication.
Yeah, well, they're fascists, obviously, right? The people who republicize it, and says a lot about what's happening in Central and Eastern Europe at the moment. If this book can come out and it's still possible to buy it online, right? So the situation in the continent is quite different from the UK, I would say, around how active the alt-right and neo-Nazi groups are. And I would think that mushroom fever, which we were talking about at the beginning, which happens in this popular culture, English-speaking popular culture, is slightly coming from a different kind of source then this is really attached to, you know, Nazism and the 1930s, and it's just a different mushroom fever, I would say. Yeah, thank you for the question. Questions?
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the talk. This is a somewhat personal question, so answer it however feels most appropriate. But I'm interested in sort of reflecting on your experience as someone who grew up, sort of doing this, foraging for mushrooms as just sort of a family practice, as a cultural practice, then coming to the English-speaking world and seeing this sort of develop as an academic discourse and as something that sort of is exported as metaphor to all sorts of other disciplines. And so what is it like to have this very sort of entrenched practice become something that's also a part of your academic rather than English academia more broadly?
Yeah, so firstly, it's really great to be a mushroom hunter in the UK because there's no competition. You know, you can find edible mushrooms in the park. That wouldn't happen in Czechia because everyone literally is possibly a competition, and you have to, you know, people wouldn't share the spots they go to, and it's very, yeah, everyone does it, right? So that's good about here, that it's happening, that there is this mushroom fever thing as well. Firstly, I'm part of that kind of process, right? As I said, you know, I'm in a way trying to intervene in it, but obviously all my research and the fact that I'm even invited to give a talk today is because of this mushroom fever, right? So I'm having like a kind of like a, maybe also the pharmacon-like approach to that or relationship to that, but it also make me maybe realize and think about how everything which is not happening in English is just not accepted, or people don't pay attention, or maybe it's not even deliberate, you know, it's just there's such a kind of disproportion between how much attention whatever happens in English gets and other languages or other parts of the world. It just makes that very obvious to me, I think. And it, in a way, it's also I enjoy that research because, you know, all these things you learn, post-colonial theory, queer theory, feminist theory, like on this example, which I have some kind of like a close relationship to, it makes it very obvious, you know, or the examples were that kind of like the things which are happening with the mushroom and mushroom fever, I can relate to things I experience myself. And I think it brings some other kind of understanding than just the theoretical one. Yeah, and it's very interesting to just observe that also as myself as an academic, you know, that it makes me to think about my language, you know, how the names of mushrooms sound in different languages, you know, or my language. And when maybe you notice that when I speak about mushrooms in Czech, because it's a gendered language, and I think about them, you know, I see Muchorunka Zelená, that she's she, right? And it's just such a different relationship to her than having a relationship to her in English, I would say. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah, I mean, this is also, this conversation is really resonating with some of the discussions that we've been having around language and the MA art and ecology, and particularly around use of you know, the word it in English and how that objectifies, but I'm also sort of thinking about what you were saying about how the sort of language of nature is the way in which othering gets naturalized, right? It becomes sort of normalized, and it's the sort of entry point by which a certain set of viewpoints and perspectives that are really unacceptable get ushered into the mainstream. I'm going to give one last chance for a question before we close. Any other final question or response? Okay. Thank you so much, Lenka. That was an amazing talk.